Greetings, YouTube. This is the Garage Autonomist, and welcome to The Lounge. First, I want to thank Curious as a guest and, quite frankly, as a co-host of 21 Questions for a Black Feminist featuring Curious because I hit upon an unforeseen technical glitch, and we had to start a whole new Hangout session because of it. The original session I scheduled was set up for the Garage Autonomist Google Plus page as a scheduled Hangout on-air event and not a live Hangout event from YouTube. I'm going to leave that to an engineering fault on Google's part and not user error. So if you create the Hangout on air from Google Plus scheduled as a Hangout on air event, you will not have the live chat enabled, which is what Curious and I wanted. So lesson learned. I assumed at that time the only way you can have a real Hangout was through Google Plus's Hangout on Air site. But back to Curious. Obviously, we blew away the 21 questions idea because her statements basically covered about 50% of the 21 questions. Curious basically gave us a Black Feminism 101 overview in about 30 minutes, covering why feminism is important for Black people, as she touched not only on challenging patriarchy, but capitalism, state violence carried out by the police against Black people, and how physical and mental health affects the well-being of Black women collectively. She demonstrated the integrative nature of Black feminism as it challenges all that ails the Black diaspora, and the way I see it, could serve to heal the diaspora as well. So, I thank her for accepting my invitation to being my first guest, and it will not be her last time here. Either way, the 21 questions format will now be narrowed down to 11, as I want all my future Hangouts to be no more than an hour long. I feel that getting a lively and informative discussion crammed into an hour would be a challenge for me as a host, and in turn will make the Garage Autonomous Hangout unique in that fashion. Anyway, in terms of future Hangouts, I definitely want to continue in that vein. And so on alternate Thursdays, I will have the Autonomous Thursday Hangouts. 11 questions for fill in the guest. And then on the next Thursday, the Autonomous Thursday Hangouts Jump In Roundtable, where I invite different guests to discuss 2 or 3 set topics. Does that sound complicated? Tough titty. I'll be posting the topics and announcements every Sunday so people can see if they'll be interested in watching or joining. I want to have Pure Butterfly Spirit and Force 100able for the first Jump In Roundtable, as these people have been my earlier and stronger supporters, among others. Speaking of supporters, I want to give a needed shout out to my old subscribers and the new. And damned if I didn't pick up 6 new people last night alone, but mostly thanks to my guest, and 4 new subscribers over the last week. Last I saw, I had about 83. This is the only time you'll ever hear me talk about numbers because it's about me being appreciative of those who obviously come here to hear and watch what it is that I'm doing. I don't take y'all's decision to hit that subscribe button lightly, so thank you again. And now that does lead me to bring up why I don't really consider myself a YouTuber, but I just like making videos.
Not a YouTuber, just like making videos. Not a YouTuber, just like making videos. Not a YouTuber, just like making videos.
Much respects to Pinheads Blackson, who I subscribe to, and is another of the long line of people on YouTube I find as an inspiration because he's here to make content that teaches and challenges people to think. And that's what I want to do. So the gist of Pinhead's opening, saying that he's not a YouTuber and he just likes making videos, that what he's really trying to say is that he's not being a YouTuber, one who chases numbers. In other words, views and subs for the sake of YouTube celebrity. It seems that if that is what one wants, they either have to be purely an internet entertainer or a dehumanizing shock jock who embraces lower common denominator populist beliefs, or they embrace racism, sexism, and reactionary politics. And it seems that shit like that is popular on YouTube. But, like I said, it seems that way. Looking at the people who have subbed to me, looking at the growing popularity of John De La Logica's Hangouts, and the loyal supporters of people like Jenny McDermott, YouTube doesn't have to be left to these unwashed masses of keyboard bullies and drones born of corporate culture. As long as we keep doing what we do, more people with progressive ideas will be encouraged to come to YouTube and help tip the marketplace of ideas towards a more balanced environment. So, regularly scheduled programming will resume starting this weekend and going forward next week. I was hoping to post my video about the so-called soft coup in Brazil and the first installment of Who Are the Pro-Blacks earlier this week, but I couldn't. So look for those. And finally, before last call, have I ever told you that I like comic books? Oh, the ones I read now are considered alternative/adult-oriented indie comics. Usually it's spelled Comix. And that genre got its start way back in the late 50s and early 60s as underground comics, created by illustrators whose work were deemed illegal after the Comics Code was established. See, DC, Marvel, hell, even Archie, they could not publish and sell comics unless the Comics Code stamp was put on their titles' covers. And so if you published comic books without the code, it was like considered porn, and during that time, porn was still very much underground. See, the Comics Code Authority was formed in 1954 by the Comics Magazine Association of America to safeguard them from government regulation. They would make sure that no comics contained gore or nudity or sexual content, since minors were seen as the main customers of the comics buying market. Before the Comics Code, there was a panic among the religious right and parents in general that comic books might warp kids' brains with images of people's eyeballs being popped out or female characters depicted wearing old fetish garments, not unlike pinup models of that era. The Crypt Keeper comics, if I'm not mistaken, were one of the original titles targeted for censorship. So after the great cleanup, and as the years drifted on, some artists who chose to continue doing that work decided to sell their stuff in specialty shops, like the head shops of the 1960s and any place where counterculture was sold. Among some of the vanguard of the underground comics artists were S. Clay Wilson, Trina Robbins, and Robert Crumb. Most of their stuff dealt with whatever would shock people. Robert Crumb early on would gain the rep of being the hero for the hipster fanboys of his time, and at that same time he became a target of critique as a sexist by the feminists in that era. When underground comics were no longer seen as illegal, as long as they were sold in actual comic book stores in sectioned areas where minors would need access with a state ID to purchase them, Robert Crumb had already become a pop culture star with his famous Keep On Truckin' icon and his Fritz the Cat comic strip that would later become the first X-rated animated movie. By the mid-1970s, there was almost no point in calling underground comics underground. I was introduced to the regular mainstream superhero comics by my mother when I was 8 years old. This was when we moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico after her divorce from my stepfather. She was always into comics when she was a kid, with Archie comics being her favorite. She bought me Spider-Man and a slew of superhero comics I really didn't like. But I did find my own favorites, and I might talk about them in a future lounge episode. Now, in my time as a teen in the 1980s, I was very familiar with things like zines, which are homemade magazines put together by anyone, and the zine would be about anything. And I was into indie film, but I wasn't alienated by the concept of adult comic books being sold outside of Marvel and DC. and having nothing to do with superheroes at all. Because by the mid-1980s, I wasn't trying to hear about Captain America. Hell, at that time I was reading the two legal adult science fiction and fantasy publications that I could get away with buying as a teenager, and that was Heavy Metal and Marvel's Epic magazine. In fact, it was an article in Epic that documented the history of underground comics. And so I was fascinated with wanting to buy one. It was just one problem. I was too young to buy that shit at the time. But the 1990s rolled around, and I was taking what would become a long break from activism and life seriousness. I figured I would catch up on some reading, and why not start with alternative comics? I will have to do a future episode on all the titles and artists that I fell in love with, but these kinds of comics fit my temperament exactly. They covered slice of life, people's realistic misadventures and relations to people in the workplace, way before the fake edgy shit that we see today in most movies. Imagine an R-rated or an X-rated Seinfeld, or nuns who practice S&M. What about a woman who draws a chapter of her teen years when she had an affair with her mother's boyfriend? That was alternative comics. But I just have to say that the one series I cannot end this topic without mention is the Hernandez brothers' Love and Rockets. I was a whole decade too late to have been able to immerse myself in a world created by Jaime Hernandez, where Latino punk rock girls have misadventures crossing over with luchadores who they were caught up in world espionage and other such craziness. Then there's my favorite, Gilbert Hernandez, whose stories mostly take place in a fictional Central American town called Palomar, where he writes an epic gangster love story about a young woman named Luba, whose life has been traced all the way from her teens to her middle ages, and she is just one of the many stories and characters that Gilbert has created. So I just wanted to tell you about one of my other favorite loves, alternative comics. On the next lounge, I'll get into black representation in both alternative comics and indie film, which is a huge gripe of mine. And that will be in the next Autonomist Lounge. Until then, drive home safely from the lounge. Peace.